Why is everyone saying this is the next Gojo? This is Descarass, the strongest character in Shonen Jump's new big manga Ichi the Witch. She recently showed off a bunch of busted abilities against the big bad of the series, to which everyone jumped on Twitter to declare her status as the next Gojo. Which is funny because I completely missed it. Like, they're both the strongest character, but Gojo is straight up broken, whereas Descarass is really strong, but not like infinity strong. Plus, there's a lot more to Descarass that you don't really see in Gojo. But clearly this shows there is a lot more to the strongest trope than being OP. If that's the case, then obviously there must be something about this trope that makes it a lot smarter than people give it credit for. I mean, it produces some of the best characters in every anime, so clearly there's a lot more to this trope under the surface. That's why in this video, I'd like to examine some of the best examples of the strongest trope, discuss the 3 things that each of these characters have in common, and explain why this brainless trope always hits. Now, before I get to some examples, I want to make sure we're clear on who does and who doesn't fit into this trope, because this trope has a few different names like the strongest character or the broken character, so when everyone likes to label any character with OP done right, it tends to inflate the meaning. Obviously, there's no official definition, but the best definition goes something like this. The strongest is a trope, where you have a character that is objectively the strongest character in the story and is not the main character or the villain. So obviously Gojo is a great example of this because he is the strongest character in Jujutsu Kaisen. Sukuna is probably stronger without getting into spoilers, but he's the villain. Another example would be Benimaru. Benimaru is objectively the strongest member of the Fire Force, but he's not the main character. I'm gonna say more on this later in the video because it might seem like an arbitrary limit, but the reason we have these modifiers is pretty simple. Main characters need goals, so if they start out as the strongest, then that kinda kills the point of having goals. And villains usually have some evil scheme to destroy the strongest character, so they occupy a narrative role that is clearly different than that of the actual strongest character. Sort of like Aizen versus Yamamoto. Anyway, there's a bunch of variations, but the idea is that this is a character that is absurdly strong at the start of the story and almost always catches W's. Obviously, it's a fun trope because, you know, big characters go bold. Now, one problem you run into with this trope is that it's very easy for it to be brainless. In fact, it's usually just plain stupid to have a character like this. Because if you have a character that is so absurdly strong, stronger than the villain, then odds are this character kind of breaks the entire story and its power system. Actually, this is exactly what happened with Gojo. Akutami wanted to make a fun character, but he ended up making Gojo so strong that every arc had to deal with his power. So the question is, why do we like this trope when it's kind of dumb to use it and will probably ruin the story? The simple answer is because it's fun. Having a character like Gojo creates a power fantasy that lets us shut off our brains. Now, real quick before I say anything else, make sure to join the channel if you're enjoying the video. You get custom badges and emojis to show off in our weekly live streams, and you can pick which series I talk about next. But like I was saying, with a character like Gojo, it does seem dumb to have a character that essentially breaks the story, but that's kind of the point. Part of the fun of having a character like Gojo is that we can kind of pretend that we are Gojo. Basically, it's a bit of a power fantasy. The best example is when he fights Toji. Normally, Toji should be the hero of the fight. He's got no powers and he fights people with preparation like Batman. Well, that's not entirely true. He's still really strong, but you know what I mean. But Gojo is the hero of that fight. He starts out strong, is outsmarted by Toji, but then lets go of his hesitations and goes full god mode, which leads to his iconic scene where he declares that he alone is the honored one and then proceeds to completely outclass Toji. By all means, Toji should have won because he was the smarter character, and it was a classic David versus Goliath moment. But you root for Gojo because he just gets stronger and beats Toji with raw power. It's a power fantasy because we can root for our character with insane power that drops quotes so hard that they become instant memes. Which is exactly why his whole "nah, I'd win" moment went even more viral. So sure, Gojo probably breaks Jujutsu Kaisen, but we don't care. It's kind kind of dumb to have him in the story, but you're essentially trading normal logic for pure hype and aura. Does it make perfect sense? Not really. But these characters are always fun. So clearly it's worth the trade-off, and that's the genius of having a character like Gojo. But like I mentioned before, Gojo isn't necessarily the strongest character in Jujutsu Kaisen. For example, someone like Takaba could arguably beat Gojo in a one-on-one fight. In that case, doesn't that render everything I just said about Gojo completely pointless? Well, no. Gojo might not be completely invincible, but the characters that fall under the strongest trope are so beyond busted that it's almost guaranteed that they'll win every time. The reason Takaba isn't considered the strongest like Gojo is because he's what you might call a gimmick character. He has one ability that is really strong under very specific conditions. In his case, he only wins if he actually uses his imagination to its full potential. It's the same reason you never really see Elastic Man beat Superman. Gear 5th is kind of a gimmick as well, because it's not so much the power of this transformation that's scary as it is the fact that Luffy just turns everything into a cartoon. Whereas gimmick characters have one weird power that kind of breaks the rules, the strongest characters use a ton of different broken abilities while playing by the same rules as everyone else. For example, let's look at Magic the Gathering. And in case you don't know or don't care about Magic, I'm gonna make this short and sweet. There's a card called Goblin Game that basically makes you hide stuff behind your back, and if the opponent loses this weird mini game, they lose a bunch of life. That is a gimmick. It's weird and it can win you games, but it's not a guarantee. The strongest would be something like Ulamog the Defiler. He makes you get rid of half your cards, is basically impossible to target, gets an instant power boost, and he immediately destroys a bunch of your creatures before he even damages them. That's not a gimmick. That's just broken. But it's still within the rules of the game. Ulamog might be broken, but he has his limits. He costs a ton of mana, and there's still a bunch of fair ways to remove him. But because he's so impossibly strong, he's what you would call a win con. Basically, you play Ulamog, you win the game. It's the same with Gojo. Unless it's Sukuna, if you fight Gojo one-on-one, you're gonna lose. This is why it's so important that the strongest character is never the main character or main villain. In fighting games, you see people throw around the term honest character. So whereas some characters are overpowered to the point of being unfair, and some characters are strong but beat you with tricks, honest characters beat you fair and square. They beat you with straightforward, balanced abilities. Another great example of this is My Hero Academia. Deku has a bunch of abilities, but they're all very straightforward. All for One is broken because he can just steal abilities and use every ability he wants. All Might is a broken character because while One for All is very straightforward in his case, it's so insanely strong that he overpowers every other character. If you put All Might in a fight, then he's going to win. He's a win con. But again, like we talked about, he's not beating you with tricks. He's not cheating. In fact, while All Might is busted, his power comes at a cost. In his case, the more he uses One for All, the more he damages himself and loses that power. He's not completely unfair like a villain, and he's not winning with weird powers like a gimmick character. The fun of watching All Might fights is that he beats his opponent with pure power and speed. He's so strong that every time he shows up, you know he's going to find a way to win. It's why his first fight against the Nomu is so good, and it's why his next fight against One for All is so inspiring. Even when he was backed into a corner, All Might still had the power to beat One for All. It's fun to root for All Might because he finds a way to win like he always does. But to that point, you might argue that it's not actually fun at all. Part of the fun of fights is not knowing who's going to win. It's why a lot of people don't like Luffy at first, because in early One Piece, he kind of wins all the time. With a character like All Might or Gojo that always wins, it shouldn't be fun to watch them if you already know what's going to happen. So the question is, why do we like this trope anyway? Now, I'm not gonna lie, this is why this trope is kinda dumb. Like, you know they're gonna do the same shit and you pretend like it's the first time you've ever seen it. Kinda like how John Cena can wave his hand in front of his face a million times, and I'll always lose my shit whenever he does it. Part of this trope is just, you know, don't fix what ain't broke. If it works, it works. But the other thing about this trope that people like to forget is that these kinds of characters don't always win. Like, they might win a lot of fights, but that doesn't mean they don't have their own problems. All Might be the #1 hero, but a bunch of his friends die. Like, a lot. Gojo goes through the same thing. He might be the strongest character, but he's not strong enough to protect Riko or save Geto. There's a trend where these characters have some sort of survivor's guilt, which influences their motivations. Not for every character, but it is a common trend. The point is that while they might be able to win every fight in the story, they usually have some kind of tragic backstory that keeps them humble. A great example of this in a newer gen manga would be Engine from Gachi Akuta. I don't know if he's like objectively the strongest or anything like that, but the dude feels like a win con. He hasn't lost a fight yet and gives off the kind of aura that he's the strongest. Plus, like Gojo, everyone looks up to him. But Engine isn't an arrogant character. He's probably the most chill character in the story. And while we don't know too much about him, we do get a hint of his motivation early in the story. There's a scene where he gives a motivational speech to Rudo about knowing your weaknesses, and he explains that part of growing up means learning what your limits are. In this scene, we get a hint that Engine might have a tragic backstory where he was always strong, but was humbled in a very painful and depressing way. And that's why he's so chill all the time, because he kinda learned his lesson the hard way. Again, still too early, but you can see how Engine might fall into this trope. It's why I've seen a few people call him the next Gojo. But of course, the character everyone is calling the next Gojo is the one, the only, Descarass. Now, there's a solid chance you haven't checked out Ichi the Witch yet, so let me just explain how broken she is. In Ichi, there's the big bad named the World Hater, which is only the sickest title ever. Anyway, he's really strong and can wipe out entire countries in the blink of an eye. After Ichi loses to the World Hater, Descarass shows up and fights the World Hater by herself. Now, like Gojo, Descarass isn't afraid to gloat. She tells the World Hater that she's everyone's favorite uber talented badass. And after saving Ichi, she unironically calls herself the greatest, most powerful witch. Clearly not that humble. The World Hater summons an army of magic monsters, but Descarass wipes them out when she summons her magic and rains down a storm of magic swords. Then after she traps the World Hater, she summons this owl dragon thing named Golconda to learn his secret weakness. And when the World Hater asks how many magic monsters or magics she owns, Descarass trolls him by saying, "Oops, were some of them your friends?" Basically, the endgame boss of Ichi showed up to kill everyone, but Descarass is such a win con, she showed up and trolled him the entire fight. That's how broken she is. That being said, it's not like she's perfect. We find out soon after the fight that, like many of the other strongest characters, she has her own painful past. Later in the story, after we learn that Ichi has to sacrifice himself in order to eventually defeat the World Hater, Descarass tells us that she used to have a little brother, but for some unknown reason, her brother died when he was just a kid. Descarass is the greatest witch ever, but she couldn't protect her own brother. And now Ichi is under her protection, and even with all of her power, she can't do anything to stop him from sacrificing himself. So in her moment of self-pity and confusion, Descarass ponders what to do next as she drinks what is a slightly less than healthy amount of wine. The genius of Descarass's character is the irony. She's the strongest character in the story minus the World Hater, but none of her powers can save the people she cares about. It's incredibly entertaining to watch her troll the big bad, but it's painfully tragic knowing that she has this guilt at the same time. It's because of this guilt that we get one of the best chapters I've seen in a new manga. In the next chapter, Descarass approaches Ichi and proposes that they enter a blood contract. Ichi accepts, agreeing to all of Descarass's commands but ultimately becoming her family. We then find out that this means if Ichi dies, Descarass will share his fate. When the Witch Council questions Descarass, she explains that she doesn't want to be the kind of adult that dumps their problems on the next generation. What she's getting at is that she doesn't care about being the strongest if it means she can't protect the life of her family. Mind you, this is only 22 chapters into a brand new manga, and we already have a masterpiece of a chapter. The reason people are saying Descarass is the next Gojo isn't just because she's OP. A big part of her charm is that while she loves to gloat, Descarass is humbled by her survivor's guilt, and is motivated by her desire to protect the future for the people she cares about, even at the cost of her own life. And this is why these strongest characters are always fan favorites. They're kinda dumb because they usually break the story, but we don't care because they're the kings and queens of aura farming. They don't use gimmicks to win fights. They show up and overpower everyone every time. But it's something that is always fun to watch because you know it's always going to be hype. And more than anything else, we love these characters because they're secretly tragic. They are the heroes of their stories, but deep down, they feel like the biggest losers. And that's why Descarass is one of the best new characters in manga. She's badass, she trolls villains, she's a win con, but at the end of the day, she's a tragic character that can't save the people that matter the most, even with all of her broken abilities. And what's so great about her character is that this pain motivates her to mentor and guide Ichi and grow alongside him throughout the story. This is why Descarass has become such a popular character in such a short amount of time. But it just goes to show why this trope always makes the absolute best characters. But maybe I'm wrong. What do you think about this trope? How does Descarass compare to other characters? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get exclusive badges and emojis, you can pick which series I cover next, and you can get credited in future videos. Also check out my other anime and manga discussions, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.